Every blue moon, I come across a story that needs some light, but frankly, nobody is ever going to ask this question for Ask Alabama. So this week, the asker is me. I ask, is it true that people were arrested for slavery in Alabama as late as the 1950s? That's a great question, asker. I came across this because someone mentioned on Twitter an old story of a couple of guys in Sumter County who were convicted for slavery in 1954. And I thought surely this was some technicality, like a couple of criminals got arrested for kidnapping and somehow a clever prosecutor managed to tack on a slavery charge. But no, this was at least two guys running a full-on slave farm in the 1950s, and this gets dark. So during the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation was made and slavery is outlawed in the South. With an asterisk, but if I go down every rabbit hole, this is going to be a 2-hour video. For Southerners, slavery was the economic engine they had built their society on, and they were in no hurry to give it up. So their initial response was, well, if you want our slaves, you're going to have to win this war, and be prepared because, and they lost the war. So with the new rules in place, slavers started turning to more creative ways to get cheap or free labor. They would have people sign contracts that basically re-entered them into slavery. Convict leasing meant the government would lock people up for crimes as minor as talking too loud near a white woman and lease them to corporations as slave labor. But a popular method was peonage, or debt slavery. Peonage works like this. A person incurs some debt, either real or imagined, to another person and is forced to work as a slave until that debt is paid. But here's the rub, the debt never can be paid. Between interest inflating the debt and the cost of room and board being tacked onto it, it was mathematically impossible to ever pay off the debt, and presto, slave for life. In many ways, it was actually cheaper than slavery. Buying a slave could cost hundreds of dollars, but I read at least one story in the Washington Post of some guy being offered a ride, and during the ride he was offered a sandwich, which he accepted, and presto, slave for life. Anyway, peonage was outlawed in 1870, but of course the South doesn't change unless the federal government forces it to. So the practice of peonage continued unabated for decades after the Civil War, with local authorities not just ignoring it, but actively participating by having law enforcement return runaway debt slaves. But over time, the word got out and it was largely shut down, and that brings us to the 1950s and the villains of this story, Fred and Oscar Dial. So because I couldn't find any pictures of them, and because at no point do I want you to forget that they are monsters, they will be depicted as Frankenstein and the Wolfman. Fred and Oscar Dial operated a farm in Sumter County, but when the busy season started and they were low on workers, they had a plan. They traveled to nearby Meridian, Mississippi, and found some guys in custody for failure to pay off some low-level fine. The Dials would pay the fine and take the convicts back to their farm to work off the debt, and presto, slave for life. And from what I've read, it seems like this happened more than once. In 1953, two such men were brought in from Meridian, Coyley Tanksley and either Herbert Thompson or Hubert Thompson. I've seen it different ways in different sources. Anyway, after over a month of working as a full-time slave, Thompson decided he had paid back the $50 he owed the Dials and tried to take off. But he was caught, and then Fred Dial had him tied to a bale of hay and forced 6 black workers at gunpoint to beat him within an inch of his life. 2 days later, he died and his body was sent to a funeral home. It may seem weird to send the body of the person you just murdered to the funeral home like it was no big deal, but in this era and this area, it wasn't looked at as a big deal. The Dial brothers had absolutely no reason to think any local authority would bat an eye about a black farm worker covered in scars from a recent beating who winds up dead. What they didn't count on was the black-owned funeral home they sent Thompson's body to reaching out to the feds. Pictures of the body landed on the desk of the newly appointed U.S. Attorney for the region, Frank Johnson Jr. Here's what you need to know about Johnson. From what I read, he didn't care about the way things are done around here. He cared about federal law, period, and trafficking somebody across state lines for involuntary servitude and beating them to death was very much against federal law. Frank Johnson Jr. sent the FBI to the farm to investigate and ended up indicting Fred and Oscar Dial, as well as several other members of the prominent Dial clan for involuntary servitude or slavery, though he eventually dropped the charges for everyone but Fred and Oscar due to lack of evidence. During the trial, one of the character witnesses for the Dials ended up admitting he knew the Dials were beating black people on their property. The defense attorney freaked out and called for a recess, and ended up chastising that witness for surprising everybody with his incriminating testimony. But the character witness genuinely didn't understand what he had done wrong, and responded with something to the effect of, "It's not bad to beat black people in Sumter County," only he used the N-word. As the trial continued, some medical examiner tried to say Thompson died of pneumonia, and when the prosecutor asked about the scars, he attributed them to skin slippage after death. Even though it was an all-white jury in Alabama, they were not buying it. In the end, Fred and Oscar Dial were convicted in 1954 of forcing people into involuntary servitude, and Fred got an extra charge for peonage. This was the first conviction of this type in Alabama in the 20th century, and one of the last convictions for slavery of this type in the United States. But the judge only ended up sentencing them to 18 months apiece, even though they could have been jailed for up to a decade. Now you may be wondering, if that's all they got for the slavery, why not go after them for the murder? Because a murder charge would be under the jurisdiction of the state of Alabama, and in the 1950s, the state of Alabama's legal system was terrible. You may also be wondering, as I have, how you have never heard about slavery lasting until the 1950s. One of the Dial brothers lived until the 1990s, meaning a convicted slaver was alive at the same time Seinfeld was on the air. And my best guess for that is that the news just got buried, at least nationally, because just a few days after the conviction, the Supreme Court ruled on Brown v. Board of Education, and the civil rights movement kicked off in earnest. So in case you're one of those people who think the racism the civil rights movement was fighting was just about separate water fountains and white people using the N-word, it was a whole lot worse than that. The Dials weren't the only people in the country doing this, they were just the ones that got caught. History is a forest of monsters, man. I'm Jonathan Soboleski for Reckin. Hey everybody, if you liked this video, you can help us out by leaving a like and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a video. And if you've got questions about Alabama you want answered, you can leave your questions at al.com/ask. Thanks for watching.